interestingly enough, their public spaces have no shade infrastructures. So this is a series of shade infrastructures and outdoor living rooms. This was very interesting in a method that I use, what I call my palimpsest or layered mappings. We discovered that there had previously been a kind of tidal pool that branched out from the river that had been buried. So we noted that there was a lot of urban flooding that happened. A lot of the water directly went out right into the river. So we proposed daylighting this. And in fact, we, again, because there's a lot of disinvestment in the public realm design in the US, we were able to secure over $50,000 for the design implementation of the Riverwalk because from SwiftMud, the Southwest Florida Management District, which is a branch of the Environmental Protection Agency, because of the performative ecological aspects of the tidal pool. And then interestingly, again, there was this really heavy-handed gray about 4 causeways that spanned over the river. So Ashley, one of the students, really got the whole skateboarder community out when she proposed repurposing it as a skateboarder park and using the cooling natural aspects of the underside of the freeway. And also interestingly, it was just adjacent to a cancer hospital. So there were these also really interesting programmatic juxtapositions at all times of the day with the cancer survivors or the cancer patients and the skateboarders. So the city was so happy with the result of the Riverwalk that they asked me to look at the redevelopment of a 40-acre site on the inner city. And so as my own process, I do a lot of community engagement. So this is the idea, as opposed to like the top-down planning, really the notion of the bottom-up. So these are a series of design charrettes, where we had series of maps at different tables and asked the community to tell us what they thought the challenges were. So again, this Village of the Arts was actually, again, an inner city kind of core in Bradenton. It had suffered from a lot of it was from the 1920s, but it had a lot of prostitution, it had a lot of drugs, it had a lot of vacant, foreclosed spots, and so bankrupted spots. So again, the notion of the community engagement of the villagers. So the city had actually 10 years before this sent out an advertisement across America in magazines for artists, asking artists to come to this village and homestead it. So now it actually operates as a series of artists in situ, living in their houses, and also galleries. So what was important, these were the aspects that were important to them. And so just again, thinking about landscape and performative ecologies and how those can really begin to activate the commons at the larger scale. This is looking at it zoomed out on the city. At the larger scale, we began to make stitches again to the now successful Bradenton Riverwalk, and we looked at the Wares Creek and proposed daylighting it and also having rights of way along it. And so we would dedicate certain corridors or streets to green infrastructure where people could begin to bike around instead of drive around. And then we also came up with the client with a kind of tapestry. So of looking at the idea of introducing water and nature and greening the streets, and a series of phased over time, which is really important in working in North America anyway. It's very unlike places like China, I've been, where things are automatically done. And so again, this notion of green infrastructure, we proposed skinnying the streets, introducing swales and rain gardens. We looked at the larger aggregates of land, such as the 1.5 acre site of the city. We looked at aggregating foreclosed sites, the places gained from skinnying the streets. We also looked at the alleyways running in behind the houses, and those re-vacated those previously vacated alleyways. So it started to become like a kind of off-road green stitch that would connect to various larger event spaces. And also at the same time, we had blue systems because of the urban flooding that we noted was happening there. So it could be performative. These were some, secondary structures that the artists had in the back of their lot. So the idea that they would start to be, connected by these back green alleyways. We designed a kit of a plug-and-play pop-up urbanism, a kit of parts that could be deployed in these different event spaces. For the artists, a series of display spaces for the artists. And this was the larger 1.5 acre site where we proposed a a subsidized housing for the artists. And then it terminated with this kind of splash pad for the kids, which also had the impact of filtering the water. And then still in Tampa, I was asked by the city of Tampa Riverwalk manager to design a series of shade structures acting as placemakers for the Riverwalk. So again, astonishingly, in these disinvested public realms, they had no shade. So this shade structure actually had a performative ecology in that we researched with various vendors how you could paint on Wi-Fi. The Riverwalk manager really liked the idea that there could be Wi-Fi, so to get people to gather down here. We also looked that it could be a water collection system, and then the cylinders themselves could collect and harvest the water, which we could irrigate to various landscapes, or that we could recirculate it in these kinds of splash pads. And so here's also looking at the notion that these single structures could actually begin to aggregate together as well. And here's, again, a kind of an image of how these could also be a big umbrella in a massive rain event, which happens a lot. And then the second series of shade structures were actually adjacent to the river, and also had these performative aspects. And then so interestingly, they began to reconnect with the natural habitat. These are manatee, which actually swim in from the tidal, or from the estuary up into the city. So we proposed these kinds of chill out lounges where people could sit, do Wi-Fi, and look at the manatee swimming in. I moved then, so it was very far south, and I moved very far north. And these series of sites are a lot like the Bhopal Union Carbide gas explosion site. There's also the need for a lot reclaiming or reusing or remediating a lot of these what are called brownfield sites. So this was a site, La Chaudière Victoria Islands in Ottawa, which is the city that I'm from. It's the capital of Canada. This is it in the winter. It's very strategically placed, or very charged politically, because this is the river Ottawa that runs down the middle, the border between French-speaking and English-speaking Canada, which has a very volatile relationship. And then because of the natural falls, it was also the site for the Indigenous peoples as a natural healing place. So this had been abandoned by a pulp and paper mill company in 2007, which I researched and wrote about in an article in Canadian Architect that you can get online if you're interested. And so this was a studio that I ran, so it has a strong Indigenous space, which had been taken from the Indigenous peoples, a lot of kind of post-industrial fabric, and interesting interstitial spaces as well. So the students and I visited it, and then we, again, as a methodology, did a series of mappings that overlaid the landscape, the infrastructure, and the architecture, and overlaid to see what could kind of emerge. We always do a figure ground to see how the site has changed over time. And the students were also asked to kind of create a landscape and ecological palette of materials for the site. This, very interestingly, was by Douglas Cardinal, a famous Indigenous architect from Canada, whose proposal was to completely regreen it, or return it to its natural habitat and put an indigenous cultural center on it, in kind of homage to the indigenous people. And so the proposals that came out were really this kind of layered palimpsest ideas of landscape recovery, again, introducing more softer landscapes that could begin to flood and begin to have habitat along them and provide kind of recreation, to kind of reuse the tops of like the ring dam as a pathway system to create greater stitches or connections to the larger region, and then to kind of repurpose these post-industrial scapes. I'm just looking at my time, so I'm just gonna really quickly just give you images of these, again, so there's actually a very larger regional green system of pathways introduced by the French planner from the NCC, Le Grébé, in the 50s, who was a contemporary of Le Corbusier. So in fact, it's a really an amazing region in that you can just bike across the entire city. So I've kind of shifting in density as well, perhaps to something more akin to the density that India is working with, or you're working with. I've also done a series of collaborations in China with Dr. Kan Jianyu, who's the founder of the Landscape Architecture Department at Peking University in Turinscape. So this was actually, the idea of villages, which when I visited India, I noted, of course, there's a lot of, villages there's a duality between the urbanization and the villages. And so that area is undergoing a lot of reform right now. But so the students and I looked at this. So what's happening in India, you might know, is that they're putting in this massive high-speed rail infrastructure. So, what you might have been like a day's travel between Shanghai or Beijing, the major cities, is now collapsed into like an hour on the high-speed rail, right? So that's having an impact on the villages. And the area in Anhui or Shishinan, where we were located, is actually the area of a large tourism area. So we looked at the idea is how could you kind of restore these villages with its cultural and program and kind of curate the cultural renaissance happening them. And so this is an image of the infrastructure of the aqueduct, the high-speed rail, which was literally being built while we were there. So I asked the students to kind of do a series of mappings, thinking about a strategic plan and framework for ecological and agricultural tourism. I asked them to consider their intervention into the existing village across a spectrum of design scales. So this often happens kind of zoomed out, mapping the larger territories, its regional landscapes, and its agricultural and hydrological systems. So interestingly, the hydrological even embeds itself in the housing typology, where you have like courtyards that are connected to these larger water systems. And then I asked them to map the public spaces of the village through figureground and Noli maps to look for places of urban acupuncture. So again, these are a series of drilled down to the architectural scale, but having understood the nested scales of the larger landscapes of a bridge infrastructure to connect the new tourist area to the older village. This is a school space for the migrant workers' kids, or to try to get migrant workers to return to live in the village. This was looking at a vernacular typology of these large, wonderful markets that appropriate the interstitial spaces, much like India, and to learn from that and introduce in a bamboo structure, a more formalized structure along the river. To also act as an economic generator. And again, the idea of reintroducing economies through ecologies was that the locals wouldn't have to go and migrate to the city. They could stay in their villages, that we could create local economies for them based on the ecologies and the cultural ecologies. And so these students were actually looking at kind of like these Airbnbs or hotels or housing, and that with these ecological interventions that could again filter and clean the abundance of water and runoff. So they were proposing to line these planters with a kind of charcoal that would filter it before it went into the larger water systems. And then this student was really interested in the agricultural ecologies or economies, and proposed a series of places that the tourists could go, such as a demonstration kitchen, a U-Pick station, a bee house, and then that these structures could actually be kind of linked. And then so I'm going to shift now to Korea, where I've done a series of workshops. Actually, we were supposed to do one this summer, but unfortunately it's been canceled due to COVID. This is with Busan National University in Korea, and it's a workshop. So this was the idea of a kind of urban village acupuncture. And so the idea that, much like India, I've noted, there's like the informal settlement next to perhaps the more formalized settlement of public spaces of the city. So this was the site was actually a village, an urban village in the city, right adjacent to the main waterfront and the opera hall. And so the city asked the students, all of the competitions are actual projects sponsored by the cities and stakeholders. So they had these, because of the topography that slopes off to the waterfront, the houses were almost like monastery, the same typology as monasteries in northern India. So the students looked at the possibility of kind of programming the interstitial of these roofscapes. And then so the winning, I supervised 2 student teams, both of who won. So they proposed interweaving a kind of vertical urban carpet into this interstitial space, and looked at water collection that could be captured, reused for these gardenscapes, as well as filtered and recycled. And then they also looked at kind of strengthening or bettering these often precarious vertical pathways to the formal city. And then the second one also looked at this idea of programming the roofs with these different schemes. Okay. So I'm switching back, but this is my last shift. And Sonal, you can just yell at me. I'm hoping to finish in 10 minutes. But this, so where I'm working, or I'm teaching in the McEwen School of Architecture at Laurentian University. And so it's the newest school of architecture in Canada. It's in northern Canada, so it's a fairly extreme landscape in terms of its cold. And it has a tricultural mandate of English, French, and also Indigenous teachings. So I'm going to show you the studio that I coordinated and some of my research that I'm currently working on. Okay, so but I'm also learning from this process of integrating Indigenous land-based learning into the architectural curriculum. So a lot of the projects that I've shown you, I mean, I'm an architect, but again, I'm working at the intersection of landscaping, ecology, and urbanism. So this was really transformative to me, working with our community engagement with our Indigenous communities, because of their intrinsic relationship to the landscape. And I have learned a lot from this. So this was our project for a second-year architecture studio, integrates a lot of the teachings of the Indigenous peoples. So this was to basically cloud a wigwam that I'll show you, but it involved a lot of stages of bringing the students out into the landscape and learning from it in a very embodied way, instead of maybe, you know, just reading about it and, you know, theoretically learning about it. So we went out, or a crew went out, to strip the trees. It doesn't hurt the trees of its bark. This is birch bark, which would then be translated into a building skin for the wigwam. On staff, we have an Indigenous elder, this is Art, and an Indigenous knowledge carrier. So we gave, you can see these are 3-foot square birch bark panels, which we gave out to all the students. And so the wigwam is a bentwood structure on the main campus that was a project that was started by our Indigenous professor, Eladia Smoke, and in a collaboration of an Indigenous studies program Joey Lynn Wabi, who actually uses this structure to teach out of year round, which gets very cold. So some of the next stages are to finish cladding it, as well as to use reed from the bottom of the lake for its natural properties of insulation. So we do have a number of Indigenous students. So this is what the birch bark panel looks like. It has shims, like cedar shims, that the students stitch with jute to it. They showed us how to do various different patternings on it with like crushed berries. And then, so this is the building material itself. So this was the build. Again, the previous year had used bent wood structure to create this structure. And then so our student cohort sewed through jute these birch bark panels. And we also had a day where we actually tapped out the spruce gum, which acted as a kind of caulking or natural sealant to the cracks in between the birch bark. So this is an image, and we were of me and my students, and we were also involved in a ceremony with the Indigenous elder, as you can see here at the end of the evening. So, I mean, interestingly, this year, because we're COVID, I'd be curious to hear what you guys are doing, but everything we're teaching completely remotely. So we're going to be sending out packages of these birch bark panels in the mail, and we're going to have, luckily I had a grant to film the whole event with a grant that I had. So we're going to be using that film footage so that students can learn and do these panels themselves. And then I guess when COVID goes away, hopefully soon, they'll be able to come back. So I think it's very interesting in terms of the curriculum, you know, how this really embodied understanding of the landscape and the material properties of locally sourced like plants or skins, and even relationships to water and ecologies can begin to inform students' projects. So this was the second project that students did, which was a sauna, which also plays with, you know, not only passive design systems that the students study in a related design for climate change class, but also, you know, thinking about the collection of water, even thinking about the changes of state. I did show them pictures of the stepwell temples from India so that they could begin to think about the rituals that might happen on this interstitial space between land and water as a kind of new commons and civic realm. So this is my student, Rebecca. Again, you can see the kind of relationship to the birch bark folding and becoming the roof. I guess very quickly, these are two thesis projects I just directed, and I showed them to show you how Indigenous teachings and land-based learnings has really been kind of instrumental in our school, and very unique pedagogy, definitely for Canada. So this student did a timeline, and she was looking at an aqueduct. So there was basically Shoal Lake is an Indigenous community that in 1900, the city of Winnipeg, which is a major city in Manitoba and about, I would say, 200 kilometers away from this Indigenous community, rerouted their drinking water supply in an aqueduct, and thus like disrupted the natural water, flooded this site, made the water a boil-only advisory, and disconnected them. So they actually would have to take a ferry, although they now have what's called the Freedom Road. So this is a huge issue with our Indigenous populations in Canada, is like the drinking water and basic infrastructure. And so the student's first proposal was a water filtration plant, as you can see here. But as she did it, she also thought about a kind of cultural center that kind of ironically framed the aqueduct where the city folk or the settlers are getting their water from and channeling it away from the community. And she also had a series of low impact design strategies to also clean the water, the runoff, through softened landscapes and in a structure along the shore with an elevated boardwalk. And she also introduced housing or lodges you could stay at in a kind of tourism. So these are looking at some of her interventions and the riparian zones and the ecological systems she's introducing. And then she had this kind of installation that talked about the history of the site through its water. You know, and then finally, this is a student I just had this year, and again, to just kind of talk to about these unique typologies that our students are coming up with. A lot of our students are Indigenous and some are Métis, and also are very interested in working with Indigenous communities, because in our curriculum, they have various Indigenous learnings such as precedent studies. So, I mean, just interestingly, and the COVID has really kind of thrown into, for us, and I'm sure you, the notion of food security, the question of food security. So this is on the reserve. And so he was interested in learning about traditional ecological knowledge, or in this case, the Haudenosaunee ecological knowledge, and combining that with scientific knowledge. So in fact, his project looks at the larger scale, this is 6 nations, who were basically put there, like a lot of Indigenous people. This is looking at the initial, the Haldimand Tract. So this line was essentially what the Indigenous people had been given by the colonial British government. And then this is what they ended up with, 4% of that. So we had some really good discussions, like, you know, because there's a river that goes through it that has a lot of flooding, could there be a way through landscape to start recovering those public or common spaces along the river to and somewhat kind of reconnect like the treaty? And also at the nested scale of the neighborhood, this is in fact a harvesting center, a food center that he proposed. Could we like look at what's very much a settler or colonial kind of suburb? Could we begin to introduce kind of green infrastructure to kind of stitch it back and connect it back and retrofit the reserve? So again, I just showed these to you as examples of new typologies we're coming up with. This was for, it was an agricultural and harvesting center. He researched the natural ways of agriculture, which is called the Three Sisters way of growing crops and corn. And then, so this is here, the Three Sisters, and he again introduced a center. So I think I'm just going to wrap it up. You know, again, the notion of the commons. This was a competition that I supervised on my students who just recently won with the National Capital Commission in Ottawa, which is our capital, and is charged with a lot of the lands within the capital. So this was actually another example of reclaiming the commons through performative landscapes. This is a visitor center on a natural conservation area right adjacent to the village of Old Chelsea. So they, you know, and it had been very much inspired by Le Grébé plan, who was also a contemporary of Corbusier, and that they had these big parkways going through that you'd have to drive your car, that they had these big like kind of parking lots, and then the visitor center, and then the forest. But by kind of reprogramming this interstitial space of the commons, we effectively began to restitch the relationship of the village, the kind of burgeoning urbanism happening there, the reserve or the conservation area with its pathways. And again, they also had these kinds of shade structures which could collect and filter water and also have programs within them. So I'm just going to kind of conclude by talking about what my research is right now. Where I am, it's a massive extractive landscape. And I understand there's a lot of these landscapes in India as well, these previous kind of mining landscapes. So it was basically absolutely like the moon. In fact, you know, in 1970s, in fact, astronauts from NASA would come here to train because it was so much like the moon. It had no greenscapes. So kind of as a larger, here it is in the 1970s. You can see it's bare, it's naked, the landscape, because the pollution from the ore smelting basically got into the air and polluted the soil, so all the trees died. So there's been a massive writ large regreening strategy for the whole area over that time. So you can see again how this landscape of extractive landscape has changed. And so what I'm working on now, actually with the ecologists who were part of this regreening strategy, they literally went up in helicopters and blasted, like threw out seeds and blasted the rocks to get the trees to take shape. I have a grant. Sorry, these are my research, so I'll just back up. I am working with community engagement with our Indigenous community at Ameksheng Anishinaabeg, and the Director of Planning and Infrastructure, and again, the ecologist who was part of the regreening, with also Esri GIS and Firelight, which does Indigenous mapping, to begin to also look at this idea of performative ecologies and reclaiming the commons in the reserve, which might also be sacred landscapes. As I mentioned, I had a SHIRT grant, which is a government grant here, a knowledge mobilization, where I'm using it now to actually teach the incoming second year semester because they're all remote. They're not going to be on campus. So I've also been writing a series of papers thinking about how do you teach site and landscape remotely, and maybe we can have a conversation about that. And so there's also a very big Sudbury competition you might be interested in doing. It's due at the end of August. But it's Sudbury, I'm working on my own grant. Sudbury is the ecological city. So thinking at the city scale, how can we begin to regreen it as we've done at the larger kind of regional scale? But again, you should check it out. It's called Sudbury 2050. And then also when I was in India, I re-met a professor I had met in those times in Ladakh. I started the picture off, Professor Anuradha Chaturvedi, who's at SPA in Delhi. And we were talking about the recovering of the Shajanabad chowks, public and cultural spaces, through ecological urbanism. So again, in all of these projects I showed you, both in the research and the teaching, you know, it's this notion of recovering the commons and public space at the urban scales. It's also a notion of decolonizing the city through ecological knowledge. I mean, one of the things with Shajanabad, of course, it was taken over by the colonialists, are the British, and you probably know more about this than I do, but they actually shut up, they gated off, like they fenced off public spaces that you still can't get into. And again, the other things that I'm looking at is the ability of these performative ecologies to deal with climate change, that they can recover a landscape through ecological systems and performative ecologies, and also the idea that with our landscapes, we can begin to mitigate heat island effect through performative ecologies. So thank you very much. I hope everyone is still here.
Shannon, thanks a lot. Like I was waiting, I was like not wishing it should end so soon.
Okay.
Your presentation was lovely. It was like so rich with some lovely, beautiful illustrations. It like a treat for the eyes. Thanks a lot, Professor Shannon.
Thank you.
I request if anybody has any questions, they can unmute themselves and ask. So later, there are some questions reserved for myself, which I'll ask at the end of the session.
Okay, is there a place I can see the questions, or can they just ask it out loud? Because I don't see a chat box.
Yeah. So
okay. Or maybe turn on people's video. I don't know if that will crash the whole system.
Hi, Richa or Sandeep, hi, are you there?
I see the chat box now. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am, we are there.
Hi.
I was amazed by the presentation.
Thank you.
The only thing that came into my mind was, when are you coming to again?
Yeah, we are now thinking of very close association, Shannon. We want you in our design studios as well.
I mean, I guess the question is, I'm assuming you guys are all shut down for COVID, or?
We are working offline, online.
Oh, yeah. I would absolutely love to.
So we have like thinking of working on projects such as sacred groves this year. So individually, there are numerous of them which are spread all across India. So it would be a good inquiry of what these are, how, and what could be done. These are very sacred and ancient landscapes.
Wow, I would love to. You know, I love India. It was real. I mean, India was my formative, it was the first place I had ever traveled to in my 20s, right? And it blew my mind. This was in the 90s, but I always, and I did my thesis there. And so it was just really amazing to come back in December because I hadn't been back since the 90s. And so I was reminded of what an amazing country it is, right? And yeah.
Very rich culture and very heterogeneous landscape.
Yeah.
Every person, like, and the traditions, they change every. However, we do not value them as much, but definitely a very beautiful country, like other parts of the globe.
Yes. Is this question transformations triggered? Yeah.
Yes, I guess we have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting. I mean, okay, so yes, I mean, all of the indigenous reserves, like, they have been really mistreated by Canadians, really, settlers, right? I mean, it was the same. I mean, I know that India was colonized. I think that this was particularly, like, the lands were taken from the indigenous peoples, and then they purposely, like, if they had like a resource on their, on their land, the government purposely put them, where there are no resources. So they almost had to, rely on the government. But just to say, like, there's a lot of poverty on the reserves, and, even water quality, can't even imagine in Canada that our indigenous reserves have water quality issues. So, like, they were particularly precarious, right? Like, so that was the kind of question with, my student looked at the thesis, like food security. I mean, it really, I'd be interested to hear your experiences in COVID. But one of the funny things that happened when it first locked down, everyone went to the grocery stores and spent like so much money, and everyone hoarded toilet paper. I don't know if you heard about that. That was crazy. Everyone was hoarding toilet paper. But it was like the kind of question, like, what if our food supply is cut off, right? And so I got a bread maker. I started growing my garden. But there was this question, there was like this Wabashig Rice, who's an indigenous, he was on the radio broadcaster, and he's an author, and actually I've worked with him because he's in Sudbury. He had written this apocalyptic book a few years ago, Moon Over the Crusted Snow, which was like, in the event of an apocalypse, he said, where would you go? And people said, we'd go to the Indian reserves because they know how to grow food, they know how to hunt. But anyway, that's a kind of a roundabout saying, like, the indigenous peoples were really they're precarious already because of their poor, and they don't have good water or health services. So they were very much on lockdown. But yeah, so that's been why, like, it's been hard for me to continue the community engagement. Like, it's all by Zoom. And even like with the students, and I did a recent pivot for the ACSA, which was the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture, like saying, how do you teach landscape remotely? Because I don't know what you guys do, but it's very much about taking our students out into the landscape, giving them an embodied knowledge of it, learning about place. Like, we have a very specific mining extracted landscape, turned green landscape, where our city was formed by like a meteor. So yeah, I mean, so those are, we're figuring that out.
We have another question by Abha, Professor Shannon. How do you think urban design can become more conscious of ecology and environment?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's what I'm trying to do. I mean, I'll write that. You guys might be interested in this, actually. I encourage you to enter. It has lots of prizes, prize money, but it's the Sudbury 50 competition. So maybe you guys have some ideas. This is for our city and reimagining it. Because I think it is going to be a lot of landscape. I think it's going to be maybe decolonizing the cities, like unbuilding them, right? Having better softer ecologies or infrastructures in between our cities and the waters. So like right now, and I know you're probably familiar with Anuradha Mathur and Dilip Dacuna, right? Who talk, in fact, in India, they did the SOAK project, who talk about the fact that the line between water and land that cartographers do is really arbitrary, because in fact, it's, you know, you might say it's flooding, but in fact, like the river needs room to grow, or kind of, you know, the monsoon implode or manifest itself over the city. So obviously, I think it's de-engineering a lot of the heavy-handed, hard engineering projects, such as we looked at with the New Orleans project, the heavy-handed levees that ultimately broke, right? Because there's such a disinvestment in the public realm in the US anyways. They weren't up to code, and then they can't, you know, keep up with the changing climate change, where we're having more like massive climate events or flooding. So I think the answer is with you guys, like very much reintroducing landscapes into the cities at nested scales. So again, that could be at the typology where, you know, it's a green roof that mitigates water, that acts as a filtration. Maybe it's like green infrastructures, right? That like skinnying the streets, not privileging cars, but privileging peoples. I mean, obviously with our common spaces, we're going to have to start thinking about, we've talked about this, like social distancing mechanisms, you know, or even public transportation. We're even saying now we're seeing a lot more people biking. So we're going to have to like widen, you know, maybe rights of way for bikes. I mean, it was unfortunate, but like when I started going to China, even people were still all on bikes. So that to me, like the idea that they got rid of those and, you know, imported a kind of North American like highway was really tragic, I think, because I think now, you know, and there's also things like obesity, like, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, you know, bikeways, more alternative methods of getting around the cities. And water management.
We have 2 more questions, Sharon, from myself.
Thank you.
Like this one is from Leonardo from Manila. He's from Manila, and
okay.
He is asking about you have mentioned about a student proposal in your New Orleans project with a archipelagic concept. So she's asking how this proposal was critiqued. Will it actually work, and will there be other ecological solutions that would be provided?
Yeah, I think he's talking about the Tampa project, the Tampa book, and that was speculative. I think that was the HOK Hong Kong proposal to flood the whole city and make it into a series of archipelagos. So I mean, I should just preface by saying that these were fairly, you know, speculative projects, although, you know, like a competition, which is why I'm saying you should enter the Sudbury competition. Competitions are oftentimes to be really, you know, inventive or crazy, but, you know, oftentimes it also helps for communities like who are not designers to envision, right? So we had all the competitions on display and people could get really excited about their city for once. So that wasn't implemented. They didn't flood downtown, although sometimes it's just happening anyways, right? I mean, they did enhance their waterfront with, I mean, a public space, which is part of the Tiger grant that the massive money that they got. You know, I would say the southern US is still quite behind the times in terms of public transportation. And now I think it's, you know, it's going to be even harder to sell people on public transportation because of COVID. That's kind of going off topic. But I think that certainly with New Orleans, there was a lot of, after the Hurricane Katrina, they brought in a lot of Dutch landscape architects or people like who are very versed with designing with soft systems. So, you know, I don't know if you guys have looked at Design for Nature or Design with Nature by Ian McCard. That's a pretty seminal book. But like he shows how the Dutch actually look at the natural dune system. He's got some really nice sections you might study the natural dune system as a protection device. So they're maybe more a hybrid between natural infrastructure using natural ecologies and some hard man-made infrastructure, as opposed to the model predominantly in the US, where you separate your water from the land through these heavy these heavy barriers that ultimately will fail because we're getting we're never sized or designed for the larger, kind of climate changes we're experiencing. And I know that we're seeing that a lot, like in Asia or India, and even like these whole cities that were built under this, built in flood zones, right? A lot of, and I think predominantly India has to deal with informal settlements that are maybe built in these precarious, fragile areas.
Shannon, we have another question from Professor Sandeep Menon. So he says, we would be delighted to hear more on your study regarding teaching landscapes in this new normal, as we are all struggling with the limitations of remote learning, but we are aware of the new possibilities it could bring in. So please do share the learnings or the possibilities with us.
Yeah, I will. In fact, if you give me a second at the end, I'll share the link, because I did this pivot session with Aziza Chowni from U of T, Alyssa North, and then actually a woman from India who teaches at University of Florida, Alpanare. And we talked about how we were pivoting, and with us, we found out in March. And so we only had a few more weeks of school. So we had a site-specific design, but I was able to just go out to the site and take pictures. With us, we have a lot of snow, so it was kind of capturing the changes of season, the water runoff, the changes in the water. So I was able to document that and send it to students. But now, of course, like you, we're faced with planning the whole semester online. And now we're talking about even January, the second semester. So we went out and took a traverse that I think Anuradha Mathur would call a traverse, a crossing of the landscape. So one of the projects is design a path. So we took specific pictures and documented it. We had a drone, although we're thinking about it could be interesting to have this drone that students could maybe once a week request where we would like to fly the drone on the site. Some of the things are thinking about the students who are in Sudbury, because in fact, a lot of students are coming back. They can't get into our buildings because our buildings are all locked down, but they can live in the dorms. And because we're not in a major city like Toronto, where the COVID is higher, in fact, we're quite good here. We're pretty remote. So we haven't had a lot of cases. So in fact, the students are talking about coming back just so they can be with each other. So we thought, well, maybe some of the students who are there in the city can act as the eyes for the students in other parts of Canada, right? So they could work in teams and photograph and document for them. And again, we're going to have a lot of webinars from the Indigenous peoples. We can't go into the reserve because it's on lockdown, but he's going to he's going to film himself doing the harvesting of the landscape and some of the cladding of the wigwam. So those are interesting. And we also, on this pivot, had a really interesting idea with Alpanare. Because it's a state-funded university, all of her study abroads to India are always remote. So this idea that, maybe it's more equitable. And we're talking now, maybe we have collaborators who can be the person on the ground. So if I wanted to do a studies abroad in Bhopal, we wouldn't actually go there, but we would have our colleagues, who could document the site and act as our eyes for the site. So it's a really interesting, it's brought up some very interesting questions of equity and accessibility.
Yeah, we actually foresee this, and we are extremely even joyed to think of such a kind of a collaboration. It would be very interesting for us, and definitely will like to go for it, Shannon. So
yeah.
With you, yourself and professors, I think COVID has come out as an opportunity of really with like-minded educators across the globe. So Okay. We have one more question, Shannon, from myself. He's asking, create like about creating ecological connectivity with water systems. So, can you suggest ways this can be pushed to political agenda for implementation, especially in urban areas?
In a political agenda? That's a really good question. I mean, I do have to note that every place you work has a different political agenda. And I learned that certainly working in China, right? Where it's hard to do community engagement because it's a really top-down government. So I think really understanding, I guess, your context that you're working in. And so I guess the best example for me, I don't know what the community engagement is like in India. I'd be interested to find out. Although, like with the project with Anu, actually in Delhi, we were talking about setting up like community engagement, right, for this public project. So I think it's possible. But obviously, I think you have to be engaged with people on the ground in those contexts that you're working. So like with the Village of the Arts, it was getting them to take, the residents to take ownership of the project. And especially because in the US, there's not a lot of money to do projects. So like the idea, they would have to implement, it's kind of low tech or do it yourself. They would have to implement like the rain gardens. And so maybe it's like whatever context you're working in, whether it's the village or community in a bit like a village in a city, kind of finding the key people in that community who will take leadership and ownership and might have political connections to help kind of ease like that process, or it can kind of champion the project for you. Because like I'm imagining that's going to happen. What we're going to do when I work with Anu in Delhi, like you know, that because she's been involved with the heritage preservation, because she's a professor in Delhi, she has, I would say, the relationships to know who can be the people on the ground championing your urban project.
Thank you, Professor. And do we have any more questions? Okay, so I'm very humbled for your acceptance of for the invitation, and it was our complete pleasure to see the wonderful work you have done globally. So, and you introduced us to so many different landscapes, like from South Korea to USA, Canada, and like it was a complete delight watching your presentation, and it was so very enriching for all of us, our students and our colleagues and friends. They have attended your presentation, even people from Manila, and so that thanks again on behalf of the Department of Landscape Architecture, School of Planning and Architecture, Bhopal, on behalf of my colleagues Richa, Anupama, our HOD, Professor Dr. Sridharan, and we would like to give you this wonderful vote of thanks, Professor Shannon, and hope for future academic and collaborations with such a stunning and dynamic teacher like you. And you have, I would like to congratulate you. You have pushed the boundaries of the design projects from being theoretical to being useful to being meaningful, in being able to create a dialogue with the people, which fortunately we all try to, but somehow we are unable to achieve the full or get the full marks out of it. So I would like to congratulate you on these wonderful projects, and we hope to be enriched in future with so I'll be sharing with you later the projects that we are working on or that you would like us, so we can have a dialogue and engage in further academic discussion. So thanks again so much, Professor Shannon.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry I can't see all of you. I guess you can't turn your cameras on, but it's been delightful. I've been also, oh, hi, there you go. It's been delightful. I'm really honored to speak to you, and I would love to collaborate in some way. And so just let me know. And I also encourage you to check out the Sudbury 2050 competition. You know, now you've heard a little bit about it. I understand that over 58 countries are participating. So you might, if you have some downtime during COVID, you might want to do that competition. There's a lot of award money. So, although I'm a judge, so, but just, and I will send to Professor Sonal the link to the ACSA pivot. It was an interesting talk of professors of architecture and landscape, how to teach remotely. So I'll send that to Sonal.
Professor Shannon, one more request. We would also like to some open access research papers of yours which you would like to share, so that
Sure.
we can share in the chat box and or the video link that you were addressing to. So it could be very useful for the participants, and like, they can get to know in much detail about the work.
Okay, certainly. I will do that. Thank you.
You can mail, I will definitely share. So thanks so much again. And
I'm just going to copy all of your questions actually before we break. They were really good questions, so I'm just going to copy those. Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks and goodbye.
Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you.